The call came on a Tuesday morning when I was standing in my kitchen making oatmeal. I remember that detail because I had burned it. I was distracted, thinking about my sister Louise and how she hadn't returned my calls in 3 weeks. The smoke detector in the hallway started beeping, and I was fanning it with a dish towel when my phone buzzed on the counter. A number I didn't recognize. Area code 803, South Carolina. I almost didn't answer. "Is this Sylvia?" A man's voice, formal, measured. "Sylvia Hartman." "Yes," I said, still waving the towel. "Mrs. Hartman, my name is Andrew Colwell. I'm a probate attorney in Columbia. I'm calling about the estate of your aunt, Rosemary Jean Ashworth." I set the towel down. Aunt Rosemary. I hadn't seen her in nearly 4 years. Not since my cousin's wedding in Myrtle Beach, where she'd squeezed my hand and said, "You're always the smart one, Sylvie. Don't let anybody convince you otherwise." She was 81 then, sharp as a tack, wearing a yellow dress that made her look like she was 30 years younger. She never married, never had children. She'd spent 40 years working as a financial analyst in Columbia, lived quietly, invested wisely, and kept her affairs entirely to herself. Mr. Colwell told me she had passed away 11 days earlier. A stroke. "Quick," he said, like she would have wanted. And then he told me what she had left me. I had to ask him to repeat it twice. $4,200,000, plus her house on Millbrook Drive, a paid-off property appraised at just under $600,000, a brokerage account, municipal bonds, and 3 years' worth of carefully organized files that he described as the most thorough estate documentation I have seen in 40 years of practice. I sat down on the kitchen floor. I don't know why the floor. My legs just decided we were done standing. "Mrs. Hartman, are you still there?" "Yes," I managed. Yes, I'm here." He explained the process. I would need to come to Columbia within the month to sign paperwork. The estate would go through a brief probate. There was a no contest clause. Everything was airtight. After I hung up, I sat on that kitchen floor for a long time, the smell of burned oatmeal still hanging in the air. My very first thought was to call my husband. My husband's name is Owen Dale Hartman. We had been married for 38 years. We met when I was 24 and he was 26 at a church social in Greenville that I had not even wanted to attend. My friend Sandra dragged me. Owen was tall and had a good laugh and told me I had the prettiest eyes he'd ever seen on a Tuesday, and I was foolish enough to think that was charming. We were engaged 8 months later. I want to be fair when I tell this story. For a long time, Owen was a decent man. Not a warm man. Not the kind who remembered anniversaries without prompting or noticed when you'd gotten a haircut, but decent. He worked hard. He provided. We raised 2 children, our son Philip, who is 33 now and lives in Denver, and our daughter, Caitlin, who is 30 and lives 20 minutes from us here in Greenville. Somewhere along the line, I became invisible. I couldn't tell you the exact year it happened. It was gradual, like the way a house settles. You don't hear it moving, but one day you notice the door doesn't close right anymore. Owen started working longer hours. He stopped asking about my days. He controlled our finances completely. Had for years, actually, from almost the beginning of our marriage. I had a household allowance. That is not an exaggeration. Every week, he transferred a set amount into what he called my account, and every large purchase had to be discussed with him first. He said it was because he was better with money. I believed him for longer than I should have. I had worked for 22 years as a dental hygienist. When the children were small, I'd taken time off, then gone back part-time. Owen had encouraged me to retire at 60, said there was no need for me to keep working. that he had everything handled. I retired. I cleaned the house and tended the garden and made dinner every night and drove to my book club on Thursdays and told myself this was a good life. I was 63 when Aunt Rosemary called me with that inheritance. My first instinct was to share it with my husband. After 38 years, that instinct was as automatic as breathing. Good news, bad news, a funny thing I saw at the grocery store. Owen was who I told. I called him instead of driving to his office because I was still sitting on the kitchen floor in my slippers. His phone rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I left a message, Owen. Call me back when you get a chance. Something happened. It's good, I promise. It's good. Call me. He didn't call back for 6 hours. When he finally called, he was brisk. He said he'd been in back-to-back meetings. I told him about Aunt Rosemary, about the inheritance, about Mr. Colwell in Columbia. There was a pause on his end. How much? He said. I told him. Another pause, longer. Well, he said, that's something. We should sit down and talk about this when I get home. Think about what to do with it. He said. What to do with it? I noticed that. At the time, I told myself I was being uncharitable. He came home that evening and poured himself a scotch before he even took off his jacket. He sat across from me at the kitchen table with a legal pad. He'd actually brought a legal pad home from the office and started talking about investment strategies, paying off the rest of the mortgage. Maybe a vacation property. He said we should consolidate everything into their joint accounts for simplicity. I watched him write numbers on that yellow paper, and I felt something I couldn't quite name. A chill, maybe. A distance opening up between what I was looking at and what I thought I had. It came to me, I said. Aunt Rosemary left it to me specifically. He looked up. Well, sure, but we're married, Sylvie. What's yours is mine. He smiled when he said it, like it was obvious, like I should have already known. I smiled back. That night I lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. I thought about Aunt Rosemary, about the way she'd handled her own money, her own life. She'd never once deferred to a man, not her father, not her brothers, not any of the men she'd briefly dated over the years. She used to say, a woman who doesn't understand her own finances is a woman who is one signature away from nothing. I'd always admired that about her from a comfortable distance. I'd never applied it to myself. The next morning, before Owen was awake, I called Mr. Colwell back and asked him a question I hadn't thought to ask before. Was there anything in the will about how I could or couldn't use the inheritance? Any conditions? He told me there was one clause, a protective provision. Aunt Rosemary had structured the bequest so that the funds and property transferred directly to me, not to me and my spouse, not to a joint entity, but solely to me. She had specifically noted that no portion of the inheritance was to be considered marital property. Her attorney had drafted it carefully. It was, Mr. Colwell said, entirely valid and enforceable under South Carolina law. Aunt Rosemary had thought of everything. I hung up the phone and sat with that for a moment. Then I called my daughter. Caitlin is not the kind of person who panics. She gets that from me. The composed exterior, at least. When I told her about the inheritance, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, Mom, what does Dad know? I told her about the conversation at the kitchen table. The legal pad, what's yours is mine. She was quiet again for longer. Mom, she said carefully, when did Dad retire? He hasn't, I said. He's still at the firm. Owen was a partner at a commercial real estate company. Had been for 15 years. Right, Caitlin said. And he's how old? 66. She asked me something then that I hadn't expected. She asked if I'd ever looked at our retirement accounts, our brokerage statements, the investment portfolio Owen managed. I told her the truth. I hadn't. Not in years. Owen handled all of that. He showed me a summary once a year at tax time, and I signed what he told me to sign. "Mom," she said, and her voice had something in it I didn't recognize at first, "I think you should look." She didn't tell me why, but she said it the way you say something when you already know the answer but don't want to be the one to say it out loud. It took me 3 days to find the passwords. Owen wasn't careless exactly, but he was a 66-year-old man who had never thought his wife would look. The passwords were in a small notebook he kept in the locked drawer of his home office desk. I had never opened that drawer. I hadn't even known he kept it locked until I tried it one afternoon on instinct and found it wouldn't budge. The key was on his key ring. He had so many keys on that ring, office, storage unit, the lake house we'd sold 8 years ago, that one small key among a dozen never stood out. I waited until he was at a client dinner. I found the notebook. I sat down at his desk. What I found over the next 2 hours rewired everything I thought I knew about my marriage. There were 2 brokerage accounts I had never known existed. One had been opened in 2018, funded with transfers that I could trace back, with enough digging, to our joint savings in amounts just under the reporting threshold, $10,000 here, $9,000 there. Over 6 years, just over $400,000 had been moved into an account in Owen's name only. The second account was newer, opened in 2021. It held a portfolio worth approximately $280,000. The statements were sent to an email address I didn't recognize. And then there was the cell phone bill. I had never looked at our itemized phone bill because Owen always paid it and there had never been a reason. It took me 20 minutes to find the login for our carrier account. When I pulled up the last 12 months of call records, one number appeared over and over and over. Sometimes twice a day, sometimes late at night, sometimes on Sundays when Owen said he was at the golf course. I didn't call the number. I didn't need to. Instead, I sat in my husband's chair in my husband's office in the house I had kept clean and organized for 38 years, and I felt something shift inside me. Not heartbreak exactly, or not only heartbreak. It was more like a door finally opening onto a room I had suspected was there, but had never let myself walk into. I took photographs of everything with my phone. I put the notebook back exactly where I found it. I went to bed before Owen came home and pretended to be asleep when I heard him come through the front door. I called a divorce attorney the next morning. Her name was Patricia Cole, and Caitlin had found her, a woman with 24 years of experience in family law in Greenville County, known specifically for complex asset cases. When I sat in her office and laid out what I had found, she listened without interrupting, took notes in a small spiral notebook, and then looked at me over her reading glasses. "Mrs. Hartman," she said, "you've done a significant amount of my preliminary work for me." She told me we had grounds, clear grounds. South Carolina recognizes adultery as a fault ground for divorce, which has implications for the distribution of marital assets. She wanted a forensic accountant, a woman named Sandra Crease, who she used regularly, former IRS, thorough as they come. The process would take time. She was honest about that. 8 months to a year, possibly longer if Owen contested aggressively. "He will," I said. "He'll be very organized about it." She nodded. "Most are." She also told me something that mattered more than anything else. She said that Aunt Rosemary's inheritance, because of how it was structured and transferred, was entirely protected. Owen had no claim to it, not a dollar, not a cent. Aunt Rosemary had known something I hadn't wanted to know. I did not tell Owen I had spoken to an attorney. I went home and made dinner and listened to him talk about a development project in Anderson County, and I nodded at the right times, and I felt like I was watching our life from 6 feet above my own body. I told Caitlin. She cried. which surprised me because I wasn't crying. Not yet. She said she was sorry and I told her not to be, that she had done the right thing asking me to look. She told me she loved me. We stayed on the phone for 2 hours that night. I also told my son Philip. That conversation was harder. Philip has always been closer to his father, not in a malicious way. It was just the natural gravity of things, the way children sometimes align. He was quiet when I told him, and Denny said he thought I should try marriage counseling before I did anything drastic. I asked him if he thought 38 years of financial control and an affair of unknown length was something a few sessions with a counselor could address. He said he didn't know the full story. I said, "Philip, neither do I. That's rather the point." He came around eventually. It took several months, and a difficult conversation with Caitlin from what I understand. By the time Owen was served, Philip had stopped asking me to reconsider. Owen's reaction to being served was not what I expected. I had expected anger. He was capable of a specific kind of cold, controlled anger, the kind that never raised its voice, but somehow made the air in a room feel thinner. What I got instead was something closer to disbelief. He stood in the living room holding the envelope and looked at me like I was someone he had never seen before. "Sylvie," he said. "Owen, you don't have to do this." "I know," I said. "I want to." He told me we could work it out. He told me the accounts were a misunderstanding. He told me the phone number, which he now knew I had found, was a colleague, a female colleague, nothing more, and that I was drawing conclusions. He was calm. He was reasonable. He was persuasive in the way that someone is persuasive when they have spent decades being the only voice in the room. I had Patricia Cole's card in my pocket. I told him to contact his attorney. He hired one of the most aggressive divorce lawyers in Greenville. That was fine. Patricia had told me he would. She was ready. The forensic accounting took 9 months. Sandra Kreis was precise and methodical and utterly without sentiment. She reconstructed 7 years of Owen's financial movements, the transfers, the hidden accounts, the credit card charges that didn't match any expense I recognized. There were hotel stays. There were restaurant charges in cities Owen claimed to have visited for work. There were wire transfers in 2022 and 2023 that Sandra flagged as potentially having been dispersed to a third party. At a certain point, Patricia asked me if I wanted to know who the woman was. I thought about it for longer than you might expect. Then I said no. Knowing her name would not change anything that mattered. It would only give me something new to grieve, and I had enough to grieve already. What mattered was the documentation. What mattered was that Sandra Kreis could stand in a deposition and explain, line by line, what had happened to money that should have been in our shared future. Under South Carolina law, the dissipation of marital assets, spending or transferring marital funds in contemplation of divorce or in furtherance of an affair, is considered by the court in property division. Owen's attorney tried to minimize it, reframe it, suggested Sandra's methodology was flawed. The forensic report was 412 pages long. His attorney eventually stopped trying. There was one moment toward the end of the process that I keep coming back to. It was a Tuesday in October, 14 months after that phone call from Mr. Colwell in Columbia. I was in Patricia's conference room for what we hoped would be the last settlement meeting. Owen sat across the table with his attorney. He was thinner than he'd been a year ago. Grayer. He looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping. His attorney slid a revised proposal across the table. I looked at it. Patricia looked at it. We excused ourselves for 5 minutes. In the hallway, Patricia said, "This is a reasonable number. Not everything you might want, but fair, and it eliminates the risk of trial." I asked her what she thought. She said, "I think your aunt protected you better than he could ever have anticipated." I signed the settlement that afternoon. It's been 8 months since the divorce was finalized. I'm 64 years old and I live alone for the first time in my life. I want to tell you that it is harder than I thought it would be, because that is true. There is a particular loneliness in a house that used to hold two people. I still sometimes make too much coffee. I still sometimes make too much coffee. I still sometimes turn to say something to someone who isn't there. But I also want to tell you the other thing because that is equally true. I opened my own accounts the week after Owen was served. My own brokerage account in my name with a financial advisor Patricia recommended, a woman, as it happens, which Aunt Rosemary would have appreciated. I drove to Columbia and signed the paperwork on the Millbrook Drive house, walked through the rooms my aunt had lived in for 30 years, touched the books on her shelves and the photographs on her walls. I found a framed needlepoint in her bedroom that said, "A woman who knows her own worth negotiates from strength." I took it home. It hangs in my kitchen now where the smoke detector used to beep. Caitlin calls me almost every day. Philip flew out in April and stayed for a week, and we had the best conversations we've had in years. He didn't bring Owen up once. The financial settlement, combined with what Aunt Rosemary left me, means that I don't have to think about money the way I used to, the way I always had to, quietly, in the background, always dependent on someone else's goodwill and competence and honesty. That freedom is something I cannot fully explain to anyone who has not lived without it for 38 years. Last month, I signed up for a watercolor class at the Art Center downtown. I have never painted anything in my life. I was terrible at it on the first day, and the instructor said that's exactly where everyone starts. I drove home afterward with paint on my hands and the windows down and something playing on the radio, and I thought, this is mine. Not these hours, not managed, not allowed. Mine. Aunt Rosemary left me a lot of things. The house, the accounts, the carefully organized files that told me she had been watching out for me from a distance, in her quiet and methodical way, for longer than I knew. But the thing she left me that I reach for every single day is simpler than any of that. She left me the knowledge that it is never too late to understand your own life. I was 63 when I learned it. I wish I had learned it sooner. But I am learning it now, and that is enough. I keep thinking about the moment I sat on that kitchen floor in my slippers, still smelling burned oatmeal, holding a phone that had just changed my life. My first instinct, after 38 years, was to call Owen. That instinct wasn't love anymore, not really. It was habit, the kind of habit that forms when you hand someone else the wheel for so long that you forget you ever knew how to drive. What happened to Owen didn't happen because of bad luck or a cruel twist of fate. It happened because every choice he made was a small bet that I would never look, that I would keep making dinner and signing tax forms and asking no questions. He bet on my passivity, and for a long time, he was winning. The hidden accounts, the late-night calls, the careful transfers just under the reporting threshold, none of that required genius. It only required a wife who trusted without verifying. I was that wife for a very long time, and I have had to make peace with that. But here's what I've come to understand. The life we lead is shaped by what we're willing to examine. Owen chose comfort over honesty, not once, but thousands of times in thousands of small decisions spread across years. That is a failure of character, the slow erosion of the kind of person he might have been. You cannot build a real life on concealment. Eventually, the structure shows its cracks. His did. And I chose for too long not to look. That is my part in this story, and I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. Looking away felt like trust. It felt like grace. What it actually was, I understand now, was fear dressed up as faith. Aunt Rosemary never looked away. She spent 40 years understanding every dollar she earned, every document she signed, every clause in every contract. She wasn't suspicious or cold. She was clear-eyed. She looked at the world as it actually was, not as she wished it to be. That clarity was the most loving thing she ever gave me, and she gave it to me after she was gone, in the form of a will so carefully constructed that not $1 of it could slip through someone else's fingers. What pulled me through the hardest months was not anger, though there was plenty of that. It was something quieter. It was the decision, made fresh every single morning, to keep going, to sit in Patricia's conference room and follow the numbers, to drive to Columbia and walk through Rosemary's house and understand that someone had believed in my future even when I hadn't, to sign up for a watercolor class and be terrible at it and drive home with paint on my hands anyway. That is what I want to say to anyone who finds themselves where I was. You are allowed to be a beginner at your own life. You are allowed to start learning things at 63 that you should have known at 30. The calendar is not the point. The decision is the point. Rosemary knew her own worth. Owen thought he knew mine. And I, somewhere between a burned pot of oatmeal and a 400-page forensic report, finally decided to find out for myself. It turned out she was right.